I want you to use your imagination and follow me back long ago. The country was in the midst of the Great Depression. I was born in 1932 in Alabama. 1 out of every 4 workers in the country was unemployed. There were grown men walking the streets looking for food. Our family, of course, was suffering even more. Blacks had little or no reserves to draw upon during these hard times. It was very difficult times when I came along. Everybody was struggling. One brother said, "It's so bad, white folks are starving." I learned early in life was that my mother's 2 brothers had been drafted into World War I, where 380,000 blacks also were drafted. 200,000 of them served in Europe. And when I asked, well, what happened to my uncles? She says they never came back. So I never got to meet those uncles. I was born in Fairfield, Alabama, 6 miles outside of the infamous Birmingham, Alabama. Some called it Birmingham because they used to bomb black churches and homes. The town was divided because of segregation. All the blacks lived in one part of the town. All the whites lived in their part of the town. All the schools, all the churches were segregated. But segregation in a real way meant that when my mother wanted to shop in the bigger stores in Birmingham, she would have to go to the front of the bus, pay to get on, and then walk to the back of the bus to get on. Sometimes the mean bus drivers would drive off in the rain, leaving blacks standing there. But when you got on the bus, you had to go behind a physical barrier on the seats that said "for coloreds only." You know this story from Rosa Parks. And when we got to Birmingham proper, we had to look for toilets and water fountains that said "for coloreds only." My mother could shop in the stores, but she couldn't try on anything. If there was anything defective about the product, she had to live with it. As I mentioned, my uncles went into World War I during the time Woodrow Wilson was president. He, in fact, led the U.S. into World War I. And he was a racist. He wrote history books for students, glamorizing the Ku Klux Klan, and claimed that the Civil War was not fought over slavery, but over states' rights. This is the same man who brought the horrible Birth of a Nation movie into the White House. And that was a movie that also glamorized the Klan. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized, bombed, and killed blacks, and here was a president glamorizing them. After the Civil War, the farmer plantation owners, slave owners, wanted to get control of their properties, rebuild them, and so they got states to pass vagrancy codes, which was called black codes, where anybody they thought was idle, mostly black, could be arrested and put on a farm to work sometime as long as a year, no pay. And in Mississippi, they would return them back to picking cotton. And that's why some blacks said the time of the black codes was just like slavery. I saw some of these blacks doing that work as a kid. The impression that made on me is that it was hard to believe that some people could treat other people so badly, especially when my mother, as a religious person, had told us God had created everybody equal, no inferior, no superior people. What was going on in my family during these early 1930 days was that after my father died in 1936, my mother, even working as a domestic, was having trouble paying the rent. So we had to move out of the house where I was born and double up with my aunt and uncle who lived across the street, Uncle Charlie and Aunt Lula. Uncle Charlie later got a job in the steel mill and ended up working over 40 years in the steel mill. But here we were doubling up in this family's house, making the best of sharing food and mixing up who would sleep when and where. My mother, like many, many black women in that time, made a way out of no way. She figured out how to feed us, how to keep us housed. She worked in our white folks' kitchens as a domestic. Fortunately, where she worked was not far from where we lived, and she could walk there. And of course, sometimes she was able to bring home some extra food for us. And my younger sister was helping out by working as a domestic, and lo and behold, while on a ladder cleaning a chandelier in a white household, she slipped and fell and broke her back. And for a year, she was in a cast. During this time, I also thought I should get a job, bring in some money, take care of some of my own needs. So I got a job working for the Birmingham newspaper, distributing newspapers to the black community. The custom during that time was for black delivery boys to unload the trucks of the heavy newspapers and take them inside while the white delivery boys were playing and having fun. That had been going on for years. But on one hot day, as I'm leaving the safety of the black community and walking through the business section, white on, into the white community, I'm heading toward the delivery room, and I see what to me as a 13-year-old looks like a mountain of newspapers waiting for me to unload. And I started saying to myself, this is unfair. This is unfair. And finally, I'm saying it out loud. And the other black delivery boy says, what the hell can we do? It's been this way forever. And I said, let's leave them. And we left that mountain of newspapers and went back to the black community, and we didn't go back the next day or the next day or the next day. The big shots in Birmingham proper, the white shirts, tie-wearing business people called Mr. Martin, the manager, and asked, why aren't black people getting in the newspapers? I don't know. They just disappeared. Well, we'll take care of that. We'll arrange a meeting with the black preacher and round everybody up to find out what happened. So we all gathered in the First Baptist Church that had 3,000 members, mostly steel workers and coal miners. And this preacher was pretty independent, as you would imagine. The white shirts, tie-wearing, looked at the minister and said, why are they doing this? And he had to admit he had no idea. He had not a clue. Our parents were there, no clue. Then all eyes turned to me. And I said, everybody should unload the trucks. And to our surprise, the white shirt, tie-wearing people told the manager, starting tomorrow, that's the way it's going to be. Blacks and whites going to unload the trucks. The community, of course, knew that my father had died, and almost anywhere I was playing in the streets, after school, on the weekends, families would be willing to feed me. And some people loved feeding me because my aunt said I told everybody in the community, whoever fed me, that they were the best cook in town. So I got fed very well. By the time I was 9 years old, World War II had broken out. And I think I mentioned early on that my older brother volunteered for the Army in 1940. My uncle said he did that to avoid going into the steel mills. There's no war, so it looked like a good deal. Unfortunately, as you know, 1941, all hell breaks loose, Pearl Harbor, U.S. is in World War II. He's sent overseas, he gets injured, He comes back to the States. He yells and screams during the night. We take him to the VA. They tell my mother he's shell-shocked and he's got to just outlive it. Man up. Real men recover from the war. There was no mental health facilities available at that time. By the time I was in high school, I met Mrs. Ruth Cook. This lady, Mrs. Cook, drove me to the college that I enrolled in. Convinced them not only to enroll me, but to give me a scholarship. I think they told her, you may think he can walk on water, but we're going to give him a scholarship for 1 year and see whether he's still alive. I kept the scholarship for the 4 years I was there. The name of this college is Talladega College, started in 1867 by former slaves and abolitionists. I had gotten a deferment from the Army while I was in college. As soon as I graduated, I was drafted into the Army. And went off to Germany, came back. I'm walking around Birmingham with my uniform on. And the Birmingham police stopped their patrol car and they get out. The driver gets out, the passenger cop gets out with a shotgun. And he says, boy, what are you doing in this neighborhood? And I said, well, I used to live in this town. I want to see what's going on. Well, boy, didn't they teach you how to say, sir, where you came from? And I could hear the drill sergeants, guys who had fought in wars, saying to us, we're teaching you how to fight wars. We're going to teach you how to defend yourself and how to take someone out if they're bothering you. I could hear these drill sergeants. But I decided I would say sir to these gentlemen. I discussed this with my mother, and she says, you got to get out of Dodge. So I left and went to the University of Wisconsin and enrolled in the law school to come back and fight and teach them another way rather than through violence. And I knew the University of Wisconsin because I had gone there during the summers, as I mentioned. Now, how would a poor person be able to afford the tuition cost of a universities? This is before affirmative action. So how do I pay for this? Remember, this group of former Confederate states, Georgia, Alabama, that had fought to hang on to slavery, had been defeated. But they had come up with, let's segregate everybody. And the Supreme Court had blessed them with a Supreme Court decision in 1893 that said, as long as you provide facilities that are equal, you can separate the races. The only thing these white races heard was they had the right to separate. The unequal part, the equal funding, they overlooked. Our schools were not funded equally. But, get this, these Confederate states decided to put money in a pot to pay for room and board and tuition for us blacks who qualified for their schools as long as we got the hell out of Dodge. And I took advantage of that, and to this day, most blacks or whites know about this story. So while students were struggling to pay tuition, I had the state of Alabama paying. And now that I'm telling you this, I'm reminded that I never thanked them.
I met Jim one day while sitting in the student cafeteria at the University of Wisconsin, and I was sitting with my friend Nina, and we were minding our own business. And there's a guy sitting at the table oh, not too far from us, who kept looking at us. And he started edging over.
I sat in a seat having coffee, and I looked 40 feet over to my left, and I saw two beautiful ladies, Anne and Nina Serrano. And they claimed I started inching my chair foot by foot by foot until I was over next to them.
And we kind of noticed it, but we ignored him. Who was this guy coming over to bother us? And he edged his way, and he finally got to our table, and he introduced himself, and that was Jim McWilliams. And that's how I met Jim McWilliams. And that's how Nina and I met Jim McWilliams. And it wasn't too long after that we got the call from the students sitting in Woolworths in the South asking for support. And so one thing led to another, and Jim and I formed an organization.
We also learned that the University of Wisconsin had funded an organization called the Human Rights Committee. It had a budget, but it had been dormant.
That brought speakers to the campus. Our job was to educate and organize the student body and let them know about what was happening in the South. And so we got these funds and we started the organization. And we strategized, and we spent long hours together, and we drank a lot of beer and ate a lot of spaghetti at night, because that was when we worked together. And that's how we began to know each other.
But we got closer and closer as we are meeting and trying to figure out what to do next, and slowly started falling in love.
We brought Malcolm X, we brought W.E.B. Du Bois to the campus to speak to the students. We brought James Farmer.
We thought W.E.B. Du Bois was like Methuselah. He's in his 90s. And believe it or not, before I was 90, I thought that 90 was old.
I picked up Du Bois, took him to our house for dinner. Didn't know what a 92-year-old man would eat.
Anne whispers to me, "What do you feed a guy this old?" He overhears her, and he says,
I eat anything that anyone else eats, and I like a beer with my meal.
We brought James Farmer, also the head of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, the first group to try and integrate buses, and the one that sent Freedom Riders.
One day I picked up James Farmer and drove him to the campus, and he told me this story, that when he was a boy about 10 years old, and he had to go to the bathroom, and there were no bathrooms for Negro children at that time. And he held it, and they got back to their house as soon as they could, but he couldn't hold it. And in front of his house door, he peed in his pants. And he felt the pee going down. And he will never forget that sensation. And that was his story to me.
But we took Malcolm to one of the students' apartments where the know-it-alls wanted to challenge Malcolm. Malcolm wiped the floor with him. He was prepared for all kinds of questions.
And with Malcolm, after he spoke to the student body, we took him to an apartment with some graduate students, and we chatted with him. But what I wanted to tell you about him, he is such a strong, clear, articulate, intelligent person. And some people, like Mandela, have this aura about them. It's a special look that they have. And Malcolm had that look.
At a break time, he leaned over and he says, "You know your last name, McWilliams, is a slave name." And I said, "Yes." And he says, "Well, why didn't you do something about it? Why didn't you change it?" And I said, "Malcolm, X was already taken." Malcolm starts rolling, and I said, "Malcolm, nobody knew you had a sense of humor."
And we got to know each other. We spent long hours of learning about each other. And I guess we learned to respect each other, to laugh a lot with each other, to share our feelings. And we decided that we were a couple, and it was leading towards marriage. I had been married before and had 2 young women, young girls in my care, and there was a lot of question about what a marriage, an interracial marriage, would do. And we couldn't even go across the Potomac River to Virginia because it was against the law to be married black and white. So there was a lot of soul searching and a lot of discussion and a lot of thinking. And our bond was so straight and so strong. And we really fell in love with each other and decided to get married, because I was going to be damned if some crazy culture would keep me from being with somebody that I loved.